All right, good afternoon, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Monday, August 11th, and we got to start by talking about the summit meeting in Alaska between Trump and
Right.
Putin. So, what do you make of this? Are you surprised by the location, Alaska?
Well, somewhat surprised. I think everybody was. Nobody was mentioning that possibility. Yeah, the Russians were hinting that it would be in the Middle East, but yeah, here we are in Alaska. Of course, you think about it, it does make a certain amount of sense. Again, Alaska has geographic and historic connections to Russia, but yeah, I don't know if it's really too important. There's also the fact that in a previous conversation, the both Trump and Putin agreed that they should visit each other's countries, and so maybe this is they're making good on that prior arrangement or that promise.
Do you think that Putin is running any kind of risk by going to the United States? Is this a dangerous move or an unnecessary move for Putin to do
Yeah,
this?
right. Well, first of all, I don't think there's any risk that the U.S. government would try to seize him. I mean, unless they're just completely insane. I don't think they're quite there yet. So, I don't see that risk. You always worry about there are a lot of people, a lot of Putin haters in the U.S. They've been fed propaganda about him for years. A lot of people still in our country still believe that he stole the election for Trump back in 2016. There got to be millions of people in the U.S. who think that, and some of them live in Alaska, and others can travel up there. So, yeah, there's a little bit of a risk there, but I think it's they. I'm sure that both U.S. Security services and the Russian security services are aware of that risk and are going to do their whatever they can to prevent it.
Do you think there's any chance of some type of scheme from the U.S. government? I mean, you say like, okay,
Yeah.
they're not that insane, but we did see what the United States do to the Iranians during the nuclear negotiations there. They helped pull off a decapitation sucker punch strike against Iran with Israel. So, is there any type of risk? I mean,
Well, you can never say there's no risk, and there certainly is. We've seen U.S. recklessness and Trump's unpredictability on display. So you just can't say that it's just absolutely impossible. I don't see that happening. I mean, in the case of Iran, that was treacherous. It was, I think, in the end, self-destructive. But by doing, what they didn't risk World War III. It didn't come anywhere close to it. Well, maybe they came somewhere. They didn't come anywhere close to it. What they did was dangerous. It was treacherous, and in the end, it was stupid. But it wasn't going to take us immediately to the verge of World War III. But let's say seizing Putin on American territory would take us immediately to the verge of World War III. So I don't think the situations are comparable.
right. I mean, that's if you're operating on the assumption that we don't want World War III. But there's part of me that just thinks like, is there a small chance, like a 1% chance that, Trump is just so screwed with the Epstein stuff or whatever that he's like, okay, we got to start World War III. But the reality is World War III is not that easy to start right away. You can't just nuke somebody out of the blue. But if you say like, oh, I'm following up on an ICC arrest warrant for Putin. Now he's here. We tricked him. We got him. There's an instant way to get you right to the edge of World War III if that's what you wanted to. That's the only thing that I'm
If you
thinking
want it.
possibly is that a move is that
Well,
some people
again,
may want this.
I wish I could say I could completely discount, this possibility, but I can't. I just would say it's like 1% of 1% of 1%. It's very, very unlikely.
So you're telling me there's a
I-
chance.
Yeah, there's always a chance. But of course, you have to remember that the U.S. also is not a signatory to the Rome statute. So that ICC warrant does not have any legal effect in U.S. territory.
Do you think it was a smart move to agree to this meeting for Putin to do this? Like, was this just just throwing a bone to Trump, and is that a smart thing to do? Because we've done this before, right?
Right. I think it's a little bit risky. I'm not sure that it's a smart move. I mean, in the past, he said, yeah, I would love to meet with Trump, but we need to actually get somewhere first. That's always been his position, which seemed to me a very sensible position. It's just like, we have to be close. We have to actually have, most of the hard work done before we can sit down and have a productive summit. And clearly they're not at that stage yet. And the Russians themselves say it. So, why did he decide to do this? I think it's a calculated risk. Maybe he sees that Trump is actually in a very tight spot. And because of, him painting himself into a corner with these threats of the tariffs and so on, that clearly was just failed. That approach of threatening China and bullying, and not China, well, threatening China, but as a way of actually putting pressure on Russia and thereby bringing Russia to the negotiating table. That clearly failed. Now, why would Putin want to do this? Well, I don't think that he believes that they can actually negotiate a settlement. That it's, again, the two sides are just too far apart. I think the only thing that he could reasonably hope for is that by doing this, he might give Trump a way to walk away from the conflict, to wash his hands of it. It may make it a little bit easier for him to do that. And it seems that Zelensky has actually been cooperative in this regard. Because Zelensky has gone out of his way to say that, I can't agree to any of this. He's already rejecting the possible, proposals or proposed settlements that, might come out of this meeting. And so if Putin can walk away looking as the reasonable one, and then, offer something to Trump, and then have Zelensky reject it, again, that just may make it easier. That would potentially allow, again, there are a lot of obstacles to do this, but it would potentially allow Trump to say, hey, I did my best. We had a deal, or at least we had the beginnings of a deal. And that idiot Zelensky shot it down. So now it's just, okay, I did what I could. I'm out of here. If you Europeans want to continue to support this guy, that's fine. I'll sell the weapons to you. But, I tried, and you guys, because of course Zelensky is working together with the Europeans, you guys didn't cooperate. So it's your problem now. Maybe he could pull that off, and maybe that's what Putin is hoping to help him with.
So you think it might just be kind of a brainstorm sesh with Putin and Trump on like, okay, how do we get you out of this? How can you sell it to the American people? Selling it to the American people is not the hard part. The hard part is dealing with your own deep state, and the European Union and Zelensky, right? I mean, Trump should be putting most of the weight on the American people because he's a public servant. That's what he's supposed to be doing, is representing us. But clearly the interests of the deep state seem to supersede that of us peons here, the American people. So what do you think? Is that's what it's going to be, this brainstorming session, and that they can try to come up with some way for him to extricate himself?
Right. Well, I don't know if there's going to be a brainstorming session. From what I've heard, it's generally Putin giving lectures and then Trump starting to get impatient. So I have no idea. I would love to be a fly on the wall, but I have no idea how it's actually going to play out and how the two of them are going to communicate. But one way or another, I'm sure that, Putin is and his people are working hard to figure out the best way to maybe to open up this possibility again, to make it easier for Trump to walk away. Again, you mentioned there are those obstacles, and I agree the obstacle is not the American people, but it's more than the deep state. It's just the political class as a whole and the media establishment. We're talking about both houses of Congress, both Republicans and Democrats. I think most of them, think about Lindsey Graham. He's not going to be happy about any effort, to on the part of Trump to wash his hands of this conflict. So yeah, he's going to be up against a lot. I don't know that he can do it. Again, there are all those obstacles, and there's just Trump's divided, let's say, administration. The fact that he does not run, a tight ship. His administration never speaks with a unified voice. It's always a cacophony of voices. There's Trump's own inconsistent, mercurial personality. He's always changing his mind. So I think, it's not just the various forces that you laid out, but it's even Trump himself and Trump's administration are in a way an obstacle to the implementation of, a U.S. withdrawal from this conflict. But even, let's say, maybe from the Russian point of view, even if they, fail to facilitate a U.S. withdrawal, just by, just by sowing doubts in Trump's mind, by actually strengthening, because there's obviously a part of Trump that wants to do this. And by giving him, just sort of, making, by presenting the case for this to him directly, again, without the spin and the filtering that goes on when other people are telling him what Putin thinks, it'll just strengthen that aspect of his, of his thinking. And I know I'm speaking in strange words, but we're talking about a strange creature, and that's Trump. He just doesn't go at things consistently. But maybe if you can, again, just kind of give a push to that part of him that wants to move. You may not succeed fully, but even a partial success. Maybe you'll throw some. You'll gum up the works. You'll just make the whole effort to support Ukraine more doubtful. You may delay shipments or whatever. Like stuff that Trump's done already, and it's just he hasn't really walked away from it. And I don't think that he can walk away from it, but it'll help him to dither and just simply just to dither, to vacillate, to even if he fails to act forcefully and decisively to leave, just that kind of, at least he won't act in the opposite direction, and he'll just be there on the edge, and Ukraine will continue to receive shipments, but there will always be a question mark over it, and that's going to affect morale in Ukraine. It's going to, in the end, also affect the amount of shipments and their, the timeliness of those shipments. This is all that I can. This is like, in my mind, I think that's the best case scenario for the Russians. Yeah.
Right.
So maybe that could be an outcome. Right.
Right. Yeah, the issue is just the whole political apparatus, like you're saying, is just they won't take, they basically won't accept anything that the Russians say. So the European Union, the political elite, they're all these hardliners that basically their option is just keep on grinding the war forever, just pump it as long as we can, and, move closer to World War III. That's the only option that they're presenting. There's nothing else that they would accept. So, I mean, Trump, doesn't matter what they talk about, he's always going to be up against that media machine. That's the problem. We can't get rid of those guys. Like, we can't remove that. It's like we go into that deep state talk, all these unelected bureaucrats, this media machine, this agenda behind the military industrial complex, and just the political elite, the globalists, the Zionists. It's just, it's such a
Right.
hard beast to fight, and we're so powerless as
Right.
American people because there's democracy doesn't work there because these are not elected officials. We can't get rid of a lot of these people.
Right. Right. Well, even a lot of our elected officials really aren't representing their people when it comes to foreign policy. There isn't this, there is an exception for Israel, where you do have fervent Zionists among the population. But in the case of Russia, it's just not there. They're not being elected to pursue this war. And I think in the Ukraine, and I think by and large, given a choice, especially if they're told, well, hey, do you want to send, billions more in taxpayer dollars there or not? The answer is going to be a resounding no. That's not why we elected you. But our political class, their representatives, are, with some honorable exceptions, are in favor of the war. I think that's the unfortunate truth. And it's because, of course, they don't answer to the people. They answer to that unelected bureaucracy that you were speaking of.
Right. To the MIC.
Yeah, I mean, he has his work cut. He or any other president would have his work cut out for himself, right? Trump's up against a lot, and if he, even if he had a very disciplined team, that was completely devoted to his vision, and they all got together and they worked out a plan, a strategy to work on changing the narrative, and so on and so forth. Just a plan to execute, this withdrawal from the conflict, and they really stuck to it. And Trump himself was very, very consistent on it and presented, very convincing arguments and so on and so forth. It still would be a monumental battle, and they probably couldn't pull it off. But Trump is not that kind of person. He doesn't have that kind of team. So, I would just say, like, the best that from the Russian point of view you can hope for is just more chaos. And, maybe that's just what they hope they can get out of this. Yeah. At least they won't have a unified, support for the war. There'll just be a certain amount of lack of unity, yeah, and that could help them.
There's been some talk of a land swap. Do you know what this could be? Is that just Trump saying things?
I don't know. Well, that's not impossible. Again, the Russians have made clear that they're going to take the four oblasts, and we're talking about Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, and Lugansk. And, currently they have virtually all of Lugansk. It's like 99.8% or maybe even 100. There's some controversy over that. They have most of Donetsk, and they're poised to take all of it. But they still have a ways to go in both Zaporozhye and Kherson. Now, if you're talking... there is a land swap that they might be open to, and that is the land that they have taken in the Kharkov region and also in the Sumy region, as well as in Dnipropetrovsk, which is just a very small amount of land, but they have taken a little bit of land, in that region as well. So I think the Russians would be open to swapping that land. They say, okay, we'll pull out of that. We've never said that was our land. We didn't hold any referenda there. And, it's not our land according to the Russian constitution. So we can retreat from that. But, we'll give that back to you, but we must take Kherson and Zaporozhye. I think that could be a land swap that the Russians could, agree to. Now, clearly, the Ukrainians are not going to accept that. Europe's not going to accept that. That's the problems we get into when you look at any of the, substantive details of any possible deal. It's just that even if Trump himself agreed to it, he's just going to have to fight. And in this case, it would be hard enough to walk away from it. I don't think it's utterly impossible. It would be very hard to walk away from this conflict, but I think it's just utterly impossible to make that kind of deal with the Russians. It's just it's going to be the entire Western establishment, European and American, are just going to come after him tooth and nail if he tries to do that. And there's just going to be shrieks of horror and rage, and I just don't think he could survive it, even if that's something he wanted to do, and it's not clear to me that he does.
Yeah, the thing that's so frustrating, though, is when Zelensky or the Europeans start to rage and foam at the mouth at the possibility of conceding land to the Russians. is that they just don't offer any alternative. Like, well, what is? Tell us what you want. Well, how you see a way to end this war, and they don't. Their only way is like bring in all of NATO, start World War III.
Well, I mean, Zelensky will say that we want all our land back, and then, including Crimea. But even many of the European leaders are saying that that's just not realistic. Even a lot of Ukraine's strongest supporters are saying that. So I think he would be forced. One thing again is like, if to make this any kind of deal work, the Americans would have to really apply significant discipline, sustained pressure on Ukraine. Earlier we had that that interruption in military supplies of just a few days, and it's not even clear, how much, if that was total or just partial. But even if it was total, it was only a few days, and then that was that. It would have to be. The Americans would say, would have to make it clear, not another bullet to Ukraine, if you don't agree to this. But even if that happened, I think that Zelensky would just turn to the Europeans. We've seen him, indicate his willingness to do that, many times already, and just continue to fight on, with European support only. Now, that's just, he's going to just lose all the faster. He's losing as it is with everything that the U.S. and the Europeans can give him, and the lion's share of the military equipment and ammunition and so forth that he's getting from the West is from actually the Americans. So you pull the Americans out, and then you just have the Europeans. Clearly, you're losing already. You're just going to lose much, much faster. That's just a fact. Now, again, that's what Trump would have to do if he really wants, any hopes of a settlement. But he's not going to do it. I mean, already he said that what he's going to do is sell the equipment to Europe. And I think Vance repeated that today. And that may be the policy, going forward. And it's just not clear that the Europeans have, if that's going to work. I mean, I think there's maybe one sale has been made already, but they don't have a unified mechanism for doing this. In the absence of that, you have this collective action problem that you always have in the EU. You have all these different states, and it's like, oh yeah, let's let the Germans buy that. I don't, our budget's kind of tight. That's what's going to happen. That's what's happening already. And so it's just not going to work. There may be some purchases of American weapons by some European states, but it's not going to be in the quantity, anywhere near the quantity of the weapons that have been supplied, under the old arrangement. So even if we go to this, if the weapons from the U.S. aren't cut off and we go to this new kind of pay-as-you-go arrangement, it's going to be far inferior to what was there already. And in the current arrangement, of course, the Ukrainians are losing. So no matter how you look at it, no matter how you look at it, and nobody's proposed anything else really, the Ukrainians lose. So if that's the case, then what are you really doing? What are you offering the Ukrainians, right? Shouldn't you just be realistic? This is actually, this idea of a land swap, you could save Ukraine. You just say, okay, you still have all these regions, but the war is over. You can start to rebuild. You still have access to the Black Sea. You still have a very large country. And actually, the part of the country that was giving you problems that you didn't like, the Russian part of the country, that's over in Russia. And if you were smart, like Czechoslovakia was, you would say, that's good. Okay, yeah, we split, but now, we can go our separate ways and focus and, and live the kind of lives and build the kind of societies that we want. That would be a constructive way to do that, but as looking at the situation, but of course we just don't get that. So it's just this kind of nihilistic, a fight to the end. And the end, the only end that you can envisage, or maybe there are a couple of ends, it's just where one is Ukraine. Well, as far as Ukraine goes, Ukraine's always ultimately defeated. And the only real issue is Is Ukraine okay? Is this war limited to Ukraine, or does it become World War III? And then the the uh, the desolation will be just that much more extensive. But no matter what, Ukraine is gone if you continue to pursue, this current fight to the end kind of course.
There was a Gallup poll recently that showed that the majority of Americans, I want to say about 70% of not Americans, of Ukrainians were wanting to have an immediate end to the war and willing to give up territory to achieve that goal. And I believe it was only 24% that were, we'll say, fight to the end, fight to victory. So an overwhelming majority seem to be okay with the idea of a land swap today. They realize that this war is over. I think the regular everyday Ukrainian person understands better than anybody just the toll of this war and how pointless it is. How that this is that they are just being used by Zelensky in the West and just being ground to dust between these two powers, between NATO and Russia. And it's just so shouldn't for Trump, if he wants a way out, is to push like, okay, let's do a democratic process. Zelensky hasn't held elections now in well over a year. Russia doesn't view him as a legitimate leader. Technically, he's not, because he hasn't had any elections. If we know that the overwhelming majority of Ukrainians want to end this war, are willing to give up land, then we could have somebody represent that. That's the whole point of democracy, right? We want to talk about defending democracy. Let's get a democratic process in here to help achieve that goal. Is that that seems like if I was brainstorming with Trump, if I was Putin, I'd be like, hey, let's do it this way.
Right. Yeah. The problem is there's no politician that you can see anywhere on the horizon in Ukraine that actually represents that option. And in some ways you can say that the Ukrainians have the same problem that we have. They have a political class, they have an establishment that is resistant to the popular will. And, under Zelensky, starting before the war in 2022, he has been shutting down, eliminating the opposition, abolishing, opposition parties and opposition media, stripping opposition oligarchs of their assets, and in some cases, silencing, critics, even individual journalists and so on that actually do give a voice to real dissent in Ukraine. So there just isn't an opposition. There isn't another party. There isn't a politician that represents that point of view. But you're right. There has been a dramatic shift in opinion in Ukraine over the course of this war. At the beginning, it was over 70% that wanted to fight until victory, and it was people who wanted to negotiate were something like 23%. So it's a complete reversal, and that's quite a dramatic shift. And there should be, in a real democracy, there would be candidates representing that, but those candidates don't exist now. And again, Zelensky and his people, the people that rule Ukraine, the regime, and it's completely fair to call them a regime, have just eliminated all, the opposition voices. So yeah, you could have an election and Zelensky could lose, but the person who replaced him would really be no different.
It's terrifying just thinking about how quickly a country can just go full authoritarian and totalitarian. Just during times of war, your rights can just be completely stripped. And it's just amazing to think that you can be in a situation where your government is hunting down people on the street, putting them in vans and throwing them to die like that. That can happen. And it's just, that's just unthinkable. 5 years ago, I wouldn't think that we would be doing things like that. And not a European country, not something that we would be affiliated with. And it's just how okay these people are with doing something like this, with just destroying their country, destroying their people.
Right. Again, you say that you speak for the Ukrainians. Well, do you speak for the real living Ukrainians that are being grabbed off the streets? And it's happening that's been going on for a long time, and You say you stand with Ukraine, but what? Who do you stand with? You stand with those people that are again being grabbed, or you stand with the enforcers, the TCC goons, that are grabbing them. And clearly, the European establishment, where they stand. Yeah, no, it is very disappointing. But one thing also remember, certainly these trends have accelerated during wartime, but they started before. All the things that we see happening, not the forced conscription, but the suppression of alternative voices, that started, beginning in 2014. And the suppression of the Russian language and the end of the Orthodox Church and so on and so forth. All of that started, well before the war. It's not something that happened because of the war. The war gives the government, even more excuses to do that, but they were doing it before.
Yeah, I mean, it just makes me think that, could it something like that just happen here in the United States sometime, where all of a sudden, we were flirting with that suppression of speech. We had, thanks to Elon Musk ruined the X Twitter files. We saw how much that the government was censoring American people, and us just having little podcasts like this, could it just, that's just always a possibility that they could just, the government could just turn on you and just, they can, they can absorb these companies and tell them what they got to do and censor people and round people up. It's terrifying that that can happen. It just felt like such an impossibility a couple years ago for me, especially in the United States. But now even being able to think about it is a bit scary that this can happen.
Well, the worst expression of it, of course, is the press ganging. That's just the street violence perpetrated by the government. You can look at it that way, and the suppression of alternative voices and so that we saw that under Biden. Again, you mentioned some of that. Under Trump, we're a long ways from there, but some of these, I want to be careful what I want to say because I know it's a complicated issue, but the way that Trump has gone after, really actually people that oppose Israel, he's careful to distinguish between those people who are American citizens and those who are here legally on a visa. But it does make you a little bit worried, like maybe, which is, I think it's actually wrong. Again, I think previous Supreme Court decisions have made it clear that even non-American citizens, who are here legally do have a right to freedom of expression. So what he's doing I think is unconstitutional. But, just the kind of the brazenness of some of these arrests, and it's the kind of the gleefulness with which the Trump and his people have carried it out. It does make you a little bit nervous. Like, is this going to extend to more? Is this just the beginning? I think there's right. That's under Biden, I was completely with the so-called right-wing critics of Biden's overreach and the attacks on free speech. But under Trump, I think some of the left-wing critics have really, some valid arguments to make. And I think it is kind of worrying. So it's not clear where, if it happens in the U.S., it'll be, it'll be different from Ukraine. We don't have band rights per se, but it's not clear where it'll come from. I think if it'll come from the so-called right or the so-called left, or it's probably most likely it'll be some sort of very unhappy fusion of the two.
Right. Yeah. No, it's just something we have to watch out for. These our liberties can be taken away pretty quickly. We found that out. Okay, let's just wrap up what's going on in Ukraine just a little bit with the summit. So how do you see Zelensky handling this and the Europeans handling this, and what do you think they might do to potentially sabotage it, or how will they respond to this Trump summit meeting, this Putin summit, Trump summit?
Well, they have already made clear their displeasure, both Zelensky and the Europeans, and they've had meetings and they've made statements. and they put forth their alternative proposals, which is the same old things, basically a ceasefire with no promises that Ukraine won't become a NATO member at some point, and so that they're doing their they're openly opposing, and Zelensky is already shooting it down, which I think was actually a little bit foolish on his part. He should be a little bit more subtle about it to try to stand on Trump's good side. And then there's been an increase in drone attacks by the Ukrainians. And again, I was in Nizhny Novgorod just a couple days ago, and apparently there was a drone attack within the Nizhny Novgorod Oblast, not the city, which is, where I was, but in the same Oblast. And that's actually had an impact on us. It's when there are drone attacks or potential for drone attacks that the internet tends to be shut down temporarily, because a lot of these drones apparently actually make use of mobile cellular telecommunications to guide them, and so you get these sudden outages of the internet, and that may be the reason that we had some problems getting the show started. So yeah, it may be that we've seen this happen in the past. It seems very foolish to me, but it's actually the kind of the way Ukrainians do things. They're angry. They don't like the fact that these negotiations are going on, so they lash out. Maybe the idea is, again, that they want to provoke the Russians into doing something, but the Russians won't be provoked. So I think it's very foolish. There's always the potential for some false flag or whatever. There's clearly both the Europeans and the Ukrainians are dead set against this. They're very nervous about it. They're very unhappy, and they'll do what they can to sabotage it.
Okay, well, we'll see. It's coming up soon, right? Is it Friday that we're...
Friday.
This meeting's... Right. Okay. All right, well, let's move over to the Middle East for a little bit. Can you start us off by just giving us an update on Gaza? Let's start with the humanitarian situation. I've been seeing some airdrops coming in. I saw some horrific footage of one just landing on a kid, actually. Just these things come down pretty fast, and then they're in these refugee tents, and people are trying to get to them. It's chaos, right. But is it getting any better on the humanitarian side?
No, I don't think so. There are these airdrops that have been, I think, carried out by a number of nations. But airdrops are a very inefficient way, to provide aid. Trucks are just much more efficient. You can provide a lot more aid more quickly and in greater quantities, and much more safely. Because as you say, there's always a risk with these airdrops that you're going to kill or injure people, and quite a few people have already been injured, and at least one, I think at least maybe two have been killed already. The amount that you can provide through airdrops is, you can't say that it doesn't help. Obviously, anything helps, but it's not going to prevent starvation. There is something like, there are many tens of thousands tons of aid just waiting on the other side of the border. And if the Israelis were serious about ending this famine, they would let those trucks in. They're allowing very limited, amounts of aid, far below what is necessary. They continue to, what the GHF, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, that strange and really diabolical, aid distribution organization, continues to distribute aid, it must be said, but at the cost of human lives. And just every day, I look at these reports daily, and every day, so at least a couple dozen aid seekers are killed. And that tells you two things. First of all, this is a terrible distribution system, that should never have been allowed. And then second, these people are really desperate, because if receiving aid is that risky, you receive or you obtain aid at the risk of your own life, but you still go ahead and attempt to obtain it. Well, that tells you how desperate you are, and that just tells you, speaks volumes of the desperation of these people.
Yeah, the starvation. I mean, just imagine if you're a father and you have little kids, mouths to feed. It's so hard.
Yeah,
It's so crazy. Just because I'm a father of little kids. They need food all the time. Little
right, right.
babies and toddlers, and if they don't, they're just crying and screaming. Just the pain that you must feel as
Right,
a
right.
as a father. That if your
Yeah,
baby is going hungry, yeah, you'll do
yeah,
anything. I have to like,
right,
okay, well, I can't let my child die. I have
right.
to go out, and you're going to have to brave it in, and then you're just trying to get food, and then there's these people taking shots at you. And I saw some footage the other day of just, it was through the scope of an Israeli sniper, and they're filming it through the scope, and you can see them, and they shoot this just, a poor man just in the rubble, in the distance, just shoot him, and they celebrate. It reminded me of the scene from Schindler's List. I don't know why I thought about it because I haven't seen that movie since I was a kid, but I just remember a scene where there was some German guy, and he would go out the balcony. He got out of the balcony and just took his gun and just started shooting random people for fun, random Jews in the camp, taking pot shots. That's what it reminded me of. That's an instant flashback. Just, hey, look, there's just people walking around. Let's
Yeah,
just shoot them. It's so insane. I just can't imagine just being living there in Gaza and having to keep your family alive in this condition, this horrific Hunger Game style arena
yeah. No,
that
what a
they've
nightmare.
created. It's basically that's what it is. It's like a death
Yeah,
arena that nobody can come in or out, limited resources and food, and there's these certain
yeah,
checkpoints you can get to, but they're going to be shooting at you when you get there. Have fun, go out there. It's so
yeah,
sick. The whole thing is
yeah.
so
No,
sick.
it is. I think yeah, I don't know the exact number, but the last I checked, the number of aid seekers killed, again, these desperate people trying to get some food for their families was approaching 2,000, since that new aid distribution system began. And then yesterday too, we
This
had,
evil.
yeah,
I
yeah,
don't
no,
think
you
I've
just can't,
ever,
right, right.
even like
It's hard to
historically, I can't
conceive of,
think. Right, I can't even think
right,
of something so evil. It's just
right, yeah.
and this
Well,
is this is
apparently,
this is what my country is
says,
supporting. It's
yeah, no, it's horrible. I mean, it does seem to be getting through, just the horror of what's going on has started to penetrate the consciousness or of the mainstream. Maybe, saying the consciousness is too much, but they have become aware of it, and they're now having to respond to it. And even Trump, apparently there were even some footage of, emaciated children that showed up on Fox News of all places. And that's the channel he watches, and he saw it. And the story is that he had an angry telephone conversation with Netanyahu that, he said, hey, basically, hey, what are you doing there, Netanyahu? I saw you, I saw those starving kids, and he said, "Oh, that's just Hamas propaganda or whatever." But Trump apparently, according to the story anyway, shouted at him, and I, actually believe it, but but I'm not all that hopeful because of it, because I think we've seen real friction between Trump and Netanyahu in the past, but it never seems to go anywhere. It never rises to the level of policy. Yeah, Trump does, because he's not a disciplined person. Sometimes he sees things and he feels things and he just says what he feels. And, that can be kind of depart from apparently depart from policy, but in the end, it's just like, because of all the people around and whatever, things don't change. And unfortunately, there's no signs that anything will change, vis-a-vis Palestine under Trump.
so why can't Trump do anything about it? What is it? Do you think it's the Epstein stuff? Is it blackmail that they have on Trump? Is that why nothing's
Well,
getting done?
I don't know. I have to say that's possible. I just don't know. But even if, okay, so that could be what's going on, or at least it could be a factor. It could be. I admit that. But let's just set that aside and say that it isn't. It's just that, we were talking about a somewhat similar situation vis-a-vis Ukraine. Say that, even if Trump wants to walk away from there, he's got all these obstacles, including himself. And I think the same thing is true with Israel. And Israel, it's even more. I mean, he has surrounded himself with just the extremists among extremists. Mike Huckabee and all of these people. Are they're all extreme Zionists. And it's not just the people in his administration; it's the donors. Adelson and many others. It's the money. It's the it's the people that just permeate the deep state. It's just that everything is pushing one way. And if Trump at a moment, might want to think to turn, he himself, he's up against so much, but then also he himself we see is just not, he's not disciplined. He's not able to actually seize a new thought and then just kind of and then adopt a new strategy. He doesn't have a team to do that. He himself, I think, is really incapable of putting together a team like that. And so the people around him also know how to manipulate him. And when they see him going, let's say, off script on something, they know maybe not to confront him directly, and they kind of pretend they have the same idea, and that's too bad, but we got to do this. The only way out of this is to actually escalate or something. They know how to play him, and so nothing ever changes.
Well, I mean, it's costing him MAGA. I'd say he's already lost MAGA because of how he's handling everything here with Ukraine and with Gaza. I mean, Marjorie Taylor Greene and Thomas Massie are sort of taking the new mantle of MAGA, in my opinion. I mean,
well, I hope so.
Yeah. People are getting upset. Yeah. I mean, even on the right. I mean, that are traditionally pro-Israel. I think that it's gotten just so bad. If you have any heart at all, it's hard to put that away. And I think there's a change. I think even among Christian Zionists, I saw some Baptist preacher on it was just through YouTube shorts, just talking about this is not what God wants. This is not what we're talking about. This is just speaking at, which it was great to see, because usually those are some of the biggest supporters of Israel. And if it's starting to crack there, it's over for Israel. Just wondering how far will they go before it ends? How hated can they become? How many people can they kill before it stops? And
right. Well,
it's way too many.
Yeah, you're seeing cracks. You're seeing cracks everywhere. Chancellor Merz of Germany said that he was suspending military shipments. So that I think is more meaningful than saying declaring support for a Palestinian state. That's symbolic. But this means something. Germany does supply weapons to Israel. It's nowhere near, what the U.S. does. So Israel can shrug it off, but it has to be worrying to them, and I'm sure it is. And then within Israel itself, we're seeing more and more anti-war rallies. Now, again, those anti-war rallies are really centered around the hostages and the IDF. It's like our poor IDF boys are being overworked. They're opposing this plan that Netanyahu has to actually seize all of Gaza City in northern Gaza. And to do that, the IDF told him, no, we're going to have another 100,000 soldiers to carry this out. And we may lose all the hostages as a result of this too. But he wants to do it. And so that's why most Israelis are protesting. It's not because of the suffering of the Palestinians, by and large, but there are exceptions, because even in those protests there are what they call them, the far leftists. They do have their signs, trying to remind people that, there are real people over there and they're suffering because of what you're doing. Again, the cracks in Israel are very small when it comes to it. The acknowledgement of the suffering that they've caused to these people is very limited, but it's there on the edges, and it's growing. It's still, we're talking in 2-3% territory, but it's something.
It's disgusting to me, and it's shocking that you could have people holding up all these signs of these starving kids, children that are starving to death in these protests, and your society only 2 to 3% think that's that's these are humans that we should be caring about. That there's no humanity within that society. That it's just relegated to just a couple percentage of people that would see that image and not be affected. That can think that what we're doing here is okay. It's like I'm very, very proud of those people, because it's got to be hard to be such a minority in a society that is so anti-Palestinian. Just that they just refer to them as grasshoppers, just subhuman animals that they can squash. But it's just it's just wild to me. It just makes me feel like there isn't any redemption for a society that can see starvation that they're perpetrating, and it's right in their face. It's so upfront. There's no deny. You can't say, "Oh, I didn't know this was going on. It was just my government." You guys all know. You guys were all part of it, and you guys, the vast majority, over 90% of people are okay with that. Okay, I don't know how many people are okay with it, but just the vast majority of people are okay with starving little kids to death. Like, I don't know.
I'm trying to remember. There was a poll that was done recently, and it wasn't like 98% were okay with it, but there was a majority that actually were. And then I think there are a lot of people who, would like to just pretend that this is not happening, because that's the story that they're given, within Israel, is that the only reason there is starvation there is because of Hamas, and it's, Hamas is somehow doing this, inflicting this on their own people. The logic isn't all that clear, but that's the argument that's made, and I think that there are a lot of Israelis who seize on that, a substantial proportion of the population. It's just like, this is just Hamas propaganda. And, but there is a large number of Israelis who know what's going on, admit to what's going on. The others, it's hard to believe that they really don't know, but that's what they say. Maybe they lie to themselves and they lie to others, that they don't really know what's going on. But there are people who are quite open about just starving those Palestinian children to death. And, they're not just a tiny fringe, unfortunately. They have their representatives people like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, and I'd have to say Netanyahu himself in their government.
It's crazy. So anyways, there is this plan to go into Gaza. You think it's actually going to happen? And how do you see that playing out if the IDF tries to take Gaza City?
Well, it seems like it's going to happen. I think I saw that satellite photos showed that there were troops were massing on the other side of the border in preparation for this major ground operation. I think it's something they can do. That clearly, Hamas has put up a very brave fight, but they're surely battered and hungry themselves, and they're up against this army, which is worn out. This was not, the Israeli military is not set up to fight these a war longer than a couple of months, and there's been a great increase in AWOLs and suicides. It is having an impact. It is wearing down the Israeli military, but not to the extent that they can't carry this out. I think they can. And it seems to me that this is actually just part of a general ethnic cleansing plan. That, again, Gaza City is in the north, and I think that what the Israelis want to do is actually just drive all the Gazans out of northern Gaza and just take it for themselves. I think that may be what's going on here.
Do you see any conflict starting up again with Hezbollah or on any of these other fronts with the Houthis or Iran?
Hezbollah.
I heard Hezbollah has reconstituted itself a bit.
Well, Hezbollah has its own battles. I mean, there has been an effort to disarm Hezbollah. And I think recently there was a cabinet decision made in the Lebanese government actually to disarm Hezbollah. And Hezbollah has just simply refused. I mean, Hezbollah is still there. Hezbollah is still a formidable force. Again, they took heavy blows, but they also performed very well on the ground against the Israeli army. The IDF never got more than a mile into Lebanese territory. I mean, they really never got anywhere. Hezbollah fought bravely, held them back. But they have suffered huge blows, the decapitation strikes and then the loss of Syria, because that's their supply route really went through Syria. So they are weakened, but they're still there. I don't think they're in any position to really help out in Palestine now.
So when this invasion of Gaza happens, you don't expect any response from the axis of resistance?
They're always the Houthis, but they can only do so much. Yeah,
and you don't see anything happening with Iran?
Yeah, I think again, Iran has its own problems. It's got to prepare for the next attack. They sustained a lot of damage. It's hard to know exactly how much damage they sustained, but we know they sustained a lot of damage. They had their own decapitation strikes, and there was quite a bit of bombing. And they do need to plug holes in their air defenses and maybe beef up and improve their missile forces. These are all things that they've got to really focus on. I don't. Yeah, they have their hands full. It's just, you have to say, I don't like to say it, but, when I agree in the long run that Israel is on a path of self-destruction. But if you look at these last couple of years, you have to say that Israel has, outside of the court of public opinion, that just looking at the military aspect, they've had real successes. I don't like to say that, but I think it's clearly true, in Lebanon, in Syria, above all. But then most recently, there was this statement about the Zangezur corridor, something that we mentioned in an earlier episode.
Oh, right.
That strip of land in southern Armenia. And that just extends because that's going to be the U.S. And wherever the U.S. is in the Middle East, Israel is too. That's going to just give them, more access to points closer to the Iranian border. It just you just see they're tightening the noose around Iran. Iran is quite upset about it for, good reason. So again, it's just Iran has been put on the defensive. I think, Iran can win this war, especially if Israel is foolish enough to attack, but they have to be ready. They really are going to have to, they can't let themselves be, caught napping like they were back in June. They're going to have to be ready for another, maybe an existential fight.
Right. Yeah, I wanted to bring that up. That corridor. What's it called? Zangezur.
Yeah, Zangezur. Yeah.
It actually does border. It touches Iran, right? So the idea is that this will be used as a staging ground to launch an attack on Iran. Is that basically?
Conceivably could be, right?
Is that what I mean? Is that the whole reason this happened? It's like, okay, Armenia, Azerbaijan, let's make some deal, and then the U.S. is going to, and Israel will get to use this land to launch an attack on Iran.
Yeah.
Basically, that's what it's for, right?
Well, it would be partially for that, I think, just looking at the the geopolitical interests involved, and then it's also it allows Azerbaijan to establish a direct link between Azerbaijan and Turkey, and they're close allies, and so there's that too. Now both Turkey again is rhetorically is very pro-Palestinian, but we know substantively they're not. They've been helping Israel, above all through the supply of oil. Israel gets 40% of its oil from Azerbaijan, and that pipeline passes through Turkey. And this will just, and Azerbaijan, though nominally a Muslim country, has been working very closely with Israel. we know that. Most of its weapons actually come from Israel. And there's been, maybe not conclusive evidence, but very evidence that suggested that some of the drone attacks on Israel were actually launched from within Azerbaijan. I don't know if that's actually been confirmed, but it appears to be the case.
Why would Armenia agree to something like this?
Yeah, well, I think Armenia, under Pashinyan, the current president, he's simply bending over backwards to please the U.S. above all, and he has dreams of joining NATO, of joining the EU, yeah, and a lot of his people are very upset about it. Armenians have a lot of connections to Russia. There are a lot of Armenians in Russia. The head of RT is actually Armenian. A Russian citizen, but of Armenian ancestry. There are millions of Armenians living in Russia, and there are a lot of people that would favor closer ties to Russia. But Pashinyan he is very, actually quite in an authoritarian manner now that he sees the reign of power as just taking Armenia into the Western camp. And part of this is giving this corridor to the Americans, and making I think that's going to be just another step. It's just another by doing that, he's proved his obedience again to the geopolitical interests of the West. And the geopolitical interests of the West in this case coincide with those of Turkey and Azerbaijan.
There's going to be this great reshuffling over the next 10 years of all these countries in the Middle East, in the United States, in the Caucasus, that have prioritized their relationship with the United States above their interests of their own country. And that their idea of how to survive in this world was you just tie your boat completely to the United States, just do whatever they say. That's coming to an end now. And I was never aware of how many leaders oriented themselves in this way around the world, that they just didn't have any sovereignty at all. Just we do what the U.S. says, and then the U.S. just gives us some money or some perks, and then we're fine. And that's coming to an end. Any leader that is adopting that position is going to find themselves out of office soon. So it's going to be interesting to see. And I think all these people are being exposed now around the world. I mean, the Middle East, it's so shameful how many of these countries, the Egyptians, the Jordanians, and you mentioned the Azerbaijanis, or Turkey, how they work with countries like Israel, to commit this genocide against their Sunni brothers. It's really shameful. It's a shameful mark, and it's something that I think Muslims should be really, carry that, realize that this is what your governments did, that these are just vassals, right. And you let your brothers die because you can't take back your country and your leaders aren't representing you. So it's going to be interesting. That's all I would say. The next 10 years, I think we're going to see all these people leave, and we're going to have a complete reorientation of the world, that all these people are going to break away and start to gravitate to the poles that benefit them the most. If you're with Russia, work more with Russia. If you're close to the United States and, we have good trade opportunities, do it with the United States. China, we can all be part of this. It's so common sense, really.
Right.
But,
yeah. In the short run, it seems you have to say there have been a lot of victories for Western hegemony, like looking at places like Moldova. Again, it's not through just an expression of the will of the people, quite the opposite. But it's simply that these governments, with the backing of the EU or the backing of the United States, once they get in power and they show themselves to be loyal vassals, they'll do whatever it takes to take their country into the Western camp. And you see that happening again in Moldova. You see it happening in Armenia, but it's not inevitable. I think it has to be pointed out, and I think Georgia is an important example of that, because Georgia, a few years ago or several years ago, looked a lot like Armenia. It looked like that's the way it was going, but it seems like the Georgians have woken up and they've said real clearly, "Yeah, we're not going to do a Ukraine here. This is not what we're doing." And just the other day too, they made a statement about that war in 2008 and said that, and they put the blame on Saakashvili, and clearly he was at fault. He launched the attack. So Georgia, you do see a reorientation. They're not. I think they still don't have diplomatic ties with Russia, but they actually trade a lot. Like just yesterday or a few days ago, I bought some Georgian wine here. There are a lot of Georgian products here, and by the way, there are Georgian restaurants everywhere. They have maintained. They are moving away from that destructive, obsession with the West that you see in places like Armenia now. Or it's not so much the Armenian people, but the Armenian government, the Moldovan government. But that's reason to be hopeful. Countries can have a color revolution and then it can fail. The people can take it back. And
right.
And some people are saying that that's going to happen because there are so many people in Armenia that are very, very upset about what's happening there. The fact that, again, he's abandoned so much territory to the Azerbaijanis, and he's just, he's basically selling off parts of Armenia to please the powers that be. The Armenians themselves are not very happy about this, and they may take back their country. It doesn't. Yeah. Again, let's hope it happens.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think these are small wins actually for Western hegemony, and because Moldova is a small country, they also had to play some shenanigans, right? Basically deny Moldovans living in Russians any chance of making it to a voting booth to actually vote in this election. So the Western Empire was able to win over Moldova, but they had to pull a lot of levers. Moldovan people, most Moldovans around the world, probably aren't very happy with the way that it was meddled with. And it's a small country. Armenia is also a very small country. So I just think they don't have that same weight. They and they have to resort to more tricks. But the more tricks that they resort to, the more that the people living in those countries are aware of those tricks and become disenchanted with the United States. And then all of a sudden, your soft power is gone there, and any seeds for future influence is evaporating.
Right.
So it's just the U.S. empire is drying up whatever little good capital it has, goodwill capital it has with these countries up quickly. And I'm surprised. Pashinyan sounds like a traitor to his country. I imagine he's not going to be in power for long.
Yeah, let's hope so. Yeah, and then in Moldova, it actually goes on. They just recently convicted a political leader, opposition political leader, to 7 years in prison, and on what seemed to me just entirely trumped up charges. So it's as you say, it's actually not even so much tricks now. I mean, they're being very brazen, very heavy-handed in the way that they're suppressing the opposition. And that's a sign that your soft power is evaporating when you have to go the heavy-handed route. It's just because you can't rely on just the media and maybe like for hire protesters or that kind of thing. You actually have to start locking up your opponents. And that's, again, both Pashinyan and what's the lady in Moldova? I think it's Sabu. That's what she's doing there, too.
Okay. All right. Well, I think we can end it there, Dad.
Okay.
Any final words you want to part with?
Well, I'll just say that I'm now in Kazan, in the Russian Republic of Tatarstan.
Nice. So actually, I knew you were going to Kazan. I didn't know you were there already. What's your first impression? You want to give us a little?
Yeah. Well, your sister and your mother definitely prefer Kazan to Nizhny Novgorod. I have a soft spot for Nizhny. I like Nizhny. I have to admit, it's a little scruffier, a little dingier, but I think it just makes it all the more lovable. But this is a nice city. It's in some ways it's similar. It's along the Volga, just like Nizhny Novgorod is. And there's a Kremlin. Each old Russian city has a Kremlin, which is to say a fort. Usually up on a hill overlooking the river. And today we wandered through the Kremlin. We went into the main mosques there, which was quite interesting. But there are also, Orthodox cathedrals up there. One thing that I'm struck about in Kazan is, you can you look here and you see an Orthodox church, and then you just look 20 degrees to in another direction, and you see a mosque. Um, so there is, this is Tatarstan. And the Tatars were Muslims, and they still have a presence. In fact, you see their signs will be in Russian and also in their language, which I guess you call Tatar. I'm not sure. Um, I think, overall it doesn't actually feel very different from, let's say, just looking at the faces, and it's still very much a Russian city. But you do see the occasional Tatar, and I think it's probably when you get outside of the city, you may see more Tatars in the smaller towns and villages.
Okay, neat. Well, if you want to take a video and give us a little report somewhere, I can include it in the next episode if you'd like. I know you're not the most social media type person, but maybe you can have Peggy take a little video if you want, and so we can see you around in
I'll talk to her
Kazan.
about it. Right.
Okay. All right, then. I'll let you go. Have a good rest of your evening, Dad, and I'll talk to you soon.
Okay. We'll see you. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.